Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into our talk today, Generations Family Change from 1840, part of the Victorian Heritage Festival program. My name is Katie and I'm Public Programs Coordinator here at the Old Treasury Building. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the Old Treasury Building is located on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Today, Margaret Anderson is going to chart the changing nature of the settler family in Victoria over generations. Margaret is a public historian with interest in women's history, the history and demography of the family, and presentations of history in museums. And she's director of the Old Treasury Building. Thanks, Margie.
Thanks very much, Katie, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. So when the first Tasmanian pastoralists arrived in Victoria in the 1830s, they brought more than their provisions and their livestock. Along with their flour, their salt pork and sheep, they also brought the customs and assumptions that had governed their lives in Tasmania, or indeed in Britain before that. Men with wives soon sent for them. For those who intended to settle permanently, shared ideas and attitudes common in the English-speaking world at the time that saw marriage and the family as the essential basis of any ordered society. Large numbers of single men were seen as a danger to social order, and this would be a palpable source of anxiety during the gold rush years. The great social reformer and supporter of assisted female immigration, Caroline Chisholm, was not alone in seeing wives and little children as essential social civilisers. By the late 1830s, the Port Phillip residents had a prime example in the domestic life of their sovereign, for Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were soon known for their attachment to family life. In paintings and later photographs, images of the royal family circulated around the empire, exemplifying an ideal of virtuous family life. By 1857, when this photograph was taken, Queen Victoria had borne 9 children in 17 years of marriage. This was a large family, but by no means unusual by the standard of the times. The Mudford family, photographed here in Kyneton in the early 1890s, also had 9 children, although the last 2 little girls you can see at the front there appear to be twins. Nevertheless, 8 or 9 live births was close to average for women in Australia for most of the 19th century, with the likelihood of either stillbirths or miscarriages in between. Now, apparently, Queen Victoria suffered no miscarriages, and her childbearing experience of 9 children born over 17 years was at the upper end of fecundity even for the times. The fact that she didn't breastfeed any of her children was probably a factor in the close spacing of her pregnancies. She didn't hold the record amongst royal families, however. George III and his wife Queen Charlotte had 15 children born between 1762 and 1783. Here they are with the first 6 painted in 1770. While Maria Theresa, Empress of Austria and mother of famous or infamous Marie Antoinette, had 16 children born between 1737 and 1756, a 19-year period. In other words, she bore a child almost every year, while also ruling jointly with her husband, the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. By all accounts, she was a redoubtable woman. Of course, royal women didn't care for their children on a day-to-day basis, and nor at this time did many of them breastfeed their children. Queen Victoria was said to be repelled by the very idea and was horrified when she learned that her daughters had chosen to feed their children themselves. She noted in her diary, "It makes my hair stand on end that my daughters have turned into cows." Ideas about infant care and mothering were changing in the upper classes of society by then, but it was also understood that breastfeeding was one means of spacing births. Ordinary women, of course, had no choice but to breastfeed if they wanted their children to survive. But let's return to our early European colonisers for a little while and consider the nature of their families. John Batman and his wife, Elizabeth Callaghan, had 8 children overall, 7 daughters born in Tasmania and a son born in Melbourne. Almost certainly there would have been more children had Batman's advanced syphilis not intervened. He died aged only 38 in 1839, by which time the couple were estranged, not surprisingly perhaps. And we don't know if there were other children born in Tasmania who didn't survive. John Pascoe Faulkner and his wife Eliza, by contrast, had no children of their own, but adopted a daughter. And childlessness was also not uncommon at this time, probably affected about 1 in 10 marriages, so not altogether different from now, actually. Amongst early officialdom, family size varied. Sophie and Charles La Trobe had only 4 children, although the long birth interval between their first child, born in Switzerland in 1837, and their second, born in Melbourne in 1842, suggests the possibility of either a miscarriage or a stillbirth in between. Sophie's recurring ill health may have prevented the birth of more children. By contrast, Captain William Lonsdale and his wife Martha had 10 children, born over a 24-year period between 1836 and 1860. Now, this is a photograph of a painting made from a sketch by Captain Philip Parker King, who accompanied Governor Burke on his visit to Melbourne in 1837. It shows the original prefabricated cottage provided to the Lonsdales on their arrival in Port Phillip. As you can see, it's very small and basic. The hut was erected near the present corner of Burke and Spencer Streets. Lonsdale's own prefabricated house arrived some months later and was erected in Jolimont. It was also quite small, but it was added to over the years, no doubt partly to accommodate all those additional children. Lonsdale's cottage was fairly typical of the types of early houses erected in Melbourne's first decades. This view of Melbourne from the Yarra was painted by Clarence Woodhouse in 1838 and shows the incredible spread of the village in only 3 years. The little cottages are all very similar, as are these individual dwellings captured by architect Samuel Jackson when he sketched Melbourne from the partially built walls of Scott's Church in 1841. These little cottages must have been bursting at the seams as families grew. Now, although I mentioned only a small selection of the early families of Melbourne, their experience is indicative of more general patterns revealed in several demographic studies conducted in the 1970s and 80s in Australia. Now, much historical demography works at a relatively high statistical level from published sources like birth and death rates. But late last century, there was a flurry of interest in a technique called family reconstitution, which used sources like parish records and then the official records of births, deaths and marriages to assemble families over time. At that point, before those records were digitised, it was incredibly painstaking and time-consuming work, and not surprisingly, only a few researchers attempted it. But those who did, and I was one, were able to establish a pattern of Australian childbearing in the mid to late 19th century, which gave us some insight into the reproductive lives of women at the time. So what were families like in Victoria in the period before about the 1880s? As we saw with the first 4 families we began with, family experience could vary hugely. But the demographic studies showed that women who married in Australia and survived through their childbearing years, which is conventionally estimated at 15 to 45 incidentally, could expect to bear between 8 and 9 live children. Now, obviously, this is based on a statistical average, or more commonly, actually, a median estimate for those of you who are statistically minded. And so it finds an estimated midpoint from those with 1 child to those with 16. And yes, I did have one family with 16 children. But we could say with a degree of certainty that most women could expect to bear between 6 and 10 children, and therefore that this was a very common experience. Mrs. Mudford, in other words, was bang on the mark. Historical demographers describe this as a pattern of uncontrolled fertility. In fact, in one of my samples, the women came close to estimates of what is considered to be maximum human fertility. What it meant was that once a woman married, she could expect children to arrive regularly. The first within a year, 2 years at most of marriage, and an additional child every 2 to 3 years after that, until the menopause gave her relief. The interval between births generally did increase towards the end of those childbearing years, but not always. Sometimes Mother Nature could show a last burst of activity and send the last couple of children in quick succession. In these circumstances, the main determinant of a woman's ultimate family size was often the age at which she married, and women in Australia tended to marry 2 or 3 years earlier than their British counterparts, and then perhaps her individual response to breastfeeding. Lactation, as I said, was known to delay further conception, although there was no real understanding of how that happened. There was no understanding of spontaneous ovulation until later. And many women did prolong breastfeeding with that in mind, but its effects were also variable, as indeed they still are. Now, childbirth at this time was both painful and dangerous. Until Queen Victoria was given chloroform for her last delivery, there was no pain relief, and in fact, there was a widespread belief that women were meant to suffer pain in childbirth in ongoing punishment for Eve's responsibility for the fall of man. The book of Genesis and the Bible laid out God's punishments on both Adam and Eve for their disobedience in eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge. The King James Version of the Bible, then in use in Victoria, has God saying to Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." At a time when much in the Bible was taken literally, this was a widespread belief, including amongst medical men. The injunction that the wife was subject to the husband's authority, of course, was also taken for granted. The perils of 19th century childbirth were many. Any form of unusual presentation was perilous for both mother and baby, with transverse presentation, that's sideways, almost always fatal. Similarly, any very prolonged labour that led to swelling of the cervix could result in the death of either mother or child, or both. The methods doctors had to use to deal with such emergencies were gory and agonising. Not infrequently, they involved either decapitating the infant in utero or crushing its skull to enable the body to be delivered. Caesarean section was not a routine procedure until the late 19th century, although the first successful operation on a living woman was performed in Ballarat in 1872, and both mother and child survived on that occasion. Other common causes of death in childbirth were placenta previa, hemorrhage, and infections from retained placenta and other causes. Now, illustrations of death in childbirth are not numerous, as you can imagine, but there are some. This painting by the French artist Jean-Loup Chamet was painted in about 1840. It shows a touching scene with the grieving family grouped around the woman who has probably just died. Her little daughter has been held up to her mother, who seems to be caressing her as she dies. It's a very affecting scene in the sentimental style that was much admired at this time. But pictures like this, the frequent reports of maternal death that appeared in the press, and not least the direct experience of family and friends, served as reminders to women of the peril they faced. And many colonial women routinely prepared themselves for death with each confinement. Their letters reveal their anxiety, not only for themselves, but for the fate of their existing children. Childbirth was often referred to as a woman's time of trial, with very good reason. At the end of the century, the New South Wales statist Timothy Coghlan estimated that 1 woman in 32 would die in childbirth, but the rates may have been higher earlier in the century. Some of the medical helplessness in the face of childbed death can be seen in the reports of such deaths in the newspapers from time to time. Here's one example, the report of a coronial inquest into the apparently sudden and unexplained death of Diana Ward, a carter's wife, in Richmond in 1849. Several witnesses attested that she'd seemed to recover well from what had been an otherwise normal delivery, but then suddenly complained of pain in her abdomen shortly before suffering seizures, just before her death. Such symptoms might indicate death from a blood clot, possibly from eclampsia or high blood pressure, although at this point it's impossible to know. The coroner's jury could find no explanation either, and they concluded that she must have, quote, died by the visitation of God. Now, one of the most feared outcomes of childbirth was postpartum infection, usually called puerperal or childbed fever, which could follow even an otherwise normal and uneventful birth. It generally set in within a day or two of delivery, and death almost always followed within a week. At a time when childbirth took place in unsterilised surroundings, infection was an ever-present danger, and once it was present, there was nothing doctors could do to treat it. My great-great-grandfather's first wife, Elizabeth Elliot, died of childbed fever after giving birth to their first child, a son they named Joseph after his father. Baby Joseph was born on the 30th of March, 1853. Elizabeth died on the 8th of April. She was then just 20. Joseph Sr.'s joy at the birth of his son was short-lived. In his diary he wrote, "A new joy, alas, not joy." Then 3 short entries, delirious, prayer, dead, and finally, alone on earth. He was then only 19 years old himself, having advanced his official age by 3 years to marry Elizabeth. Now, Joseph Elliot was a very young husband, even by the standards of the age, but his enthusiasm for marriage and family life seems to have been genuine. In this respect, he reflected widespread views associating marriage and family life with contentment, comfort, and respectability. We can see the same concepts reflected in some of S.T. Gill's paintings of Gold Rush Melbourne. His depiction of the lucky digger that returned, shown here, shows a man resting contentedly in the evening with his child on his knee, while his wife reads placidly by the fireside. The furniture in the room and the clothing of the husband and wife suggest prosperity and comfort. There are books on the tables, pictures on the walls, plus, of course, a faithful hound for extra company. Gill seems to be suggesting here that this is what the lucky digger could hope for. Not huge riches necessarily, but a comfortable family life. It seems clear that most men and women did hope to marry at this time, although their motivations were not necessarily the same. Men looked for comfort, for a sexual partner, a housekeeper, and probably children, though not necessarily lots of them. Children were expensive and a recognised cause of poverty. But what about women? It was assumed at the time that all women wanted a husband. Indeed, this was the given behind most schemes to sponsor single female immigration at the time. Artists like John Leach captured this dynamic in playful images like this one, which is titled "Alarming Prospect, the Single Ladies Off to the Diggings." It shows single women being besieged on the wharves as they arrive in Melbourne by suitors all trying to outdo each other in what they offer. The women, though, are holding out for richer pickings on the goldfields. Now, given what we know about the risk associated with marriage and relentless pregnancies at this time, we might wonder why women were so eager to contemplate it. The answer is a simple one. They had very little choice. For all of the 19th century and much of the 20th, marriage and motherhood were the only sanctioned female occupations. Unmarried women were objects of pity, scorned for not being able to, quote, get a husband, as it was often put, and of lesser social status than their married sisters. This is a recurring theme, as many of you probably know, in 19th century fiction, from Austen to Eliot and beyond. The middle-class girls almost never worked outside the home. When they were forced through poverty to do so, they often lived precariously, dependent on family charity or occupying an ambiguous social position within an employer's household. Working-class girls, on the other hand, always expected to work before marriage, but their wages were very much less than those paid to men. Widespread custom and practice set women's wage rates at about half those of men, even when they were performing very similar tasks. Male trade guilds guarded their distinctions closely, so that even in similar trades, like, say, tailors and tailoresses, for example, women were trained less, judged to be less skilled, shorter training that precluded certain skills. Such wages were rarely sufficient to support women independently, especially if there were children to provide for as well. And this was all clearly understood at the time. And it was defended whenever women challenged the status quo on the grounds that if women were paid the same as men, they'd have no need to marry. And then where would society be? It also meant that women who were deprived of a husband's support through death or desertion were often plunged into immediate poverty. The many subscriptions advertised for the benefit of, quote, deserving widows and children made this very clear. Here are two examples from Melbourne in 1862 and then 1863. The first, Mrs. Jenkins, was a widow with two young children aged 3 and 1. The second, Mrs. Pearson's husband was a seaman who died from injuries he sustained in jumping from Sandridge Pier to rescue a young boy who'd fallen from a steamer. The funds realised for her were unusually generous, sufficient to purchase a small cottage with some land and to provide an additional pension of 18 shillings a week, so that, as her benefactors wrote, the loss of a husband and father may never lead to the loss of a home. Now, Mrs. Pearson's case was unusual. Most of the widows assisted by subscriptions were middle-class women, while working women were often left to manage as best they could. That usually meant a precarious existence, taking in washing or becoming sweated workers, taking in piecework from clothing factories for a miserable pittance. Faced with this fate, many widows had little choice but to try and find another husband. Widowers, too, often looked to remarry, especially when they were left with children to care for. Advice on what qualities to look for in a wife were published frequently in the colonial press. Not so much qualities of a husband, incidentally. Here is one example from the August of July 1849. After a series of examples, the writer concluded, "The best qualities to look for in a wife are industry, humility, neatness, gentleness, benevolence, and piety. Where you find this, there is no danger. You will obtain a treasure and not regret your choice to the latest period." Now, note that appearance is not mentioned here apart from neatness. So while undoubtedly men were drawn to a pretty face, it was practical virtues they were advised to value above all, especially in colonial Victoria, where servants were comparatively scarce. A wife was often expected to work hard. Her work multiplied with the number of children. So did the expense of raising them. Large families were an acknowledged cause of financial stress, but there was little practical understanding of how to prevent conception, apart from the obvious. Abstinence was a certain means of contraception, but you won't be surprised to hear that almost no one seriously suggested it. Indeed, legally, a man had a right of access to his wife's body, his conjugal rights, they were known popularly, and he could enforce that right through the courts if necessary. His wife had a similar right, but that was rarely in dispute, although failure to consummate a marriage was one of the only grounds on which a marriage could be annulled at this time, and that could be initiated by either party. The law was silent on a man's right to coerce his wife physically. Rape in marriage did not exist in law until the 1970s in Australia, and then it was only partial recognition. Although the law did give women some limited protection against actual assault, or battery as it was often called, this was physical assault, not sexual assault. Sadly, actual physical assault or wife beating was very common. Although the police could intervene and men could be charged, they were mostly fined and set free. The middle-class press disapproved of the prevalence of wife beating, which they invariably associated with the lower orders, but acknowledged that it was often difficult to persuade wives to prosecute their husbands. It all sounds depressingly familiar. In mid-19th century Australia, family size probably reached its peak. But even at this time, both men and women were expressing a desire for smaller families. Women facing yet another confinement were consoled by their female relatives. "Do not regret the dear little strangers," one woman wrote to her sister in 1859. "God grant it may be a comfort to you. I hope that before this reaches you, the trial will be over." Joseph Elliot was more direct. In April 1854, Joseph had married again to Rebecca, his first wife's friend. She was then 18, and he gave his age this time as 22. Reading between the lines, it seems likely that Rebecca may have helped to look after baby Joseph too, although, like many hand-reared babies, little Joseph didn't survive his first year. In 1860, Joseph sat down to write a very long letter to his mother in England, enlivening the letter with little line drawings like this one. He titled the letter "Our Home in Australia," and in it he described literally everything in the house, and I mean everything, including the contents of all the cupboards and the drawers. It's quite a remarkable document. The letter suggests that Joseph was a very fond husband and father. He invariably refers to his wife with great affection. "My dear Rebecca," "my dear Becky," he calls her, and appears equally fond of his children. 3 had been born in quick succession, in February 1855, May 1856, and July 1857, although the second baby, another Joseph, died at the age of 2. Now, Joseph Sr. may have been a fond father, but that didn't mean that he wanted lots more children. In describing the contents of one little box in the bedroom, he wrote, "The other contains baby linen, put away, I hope, for a long time." Now, that might have been the plan, but it was not what happened. Rebecca went on to bear 10 children, the last in 1875. 7 survived childhood. Elsewhere in his letter, Joseph comments wryly on the cost of caring for his family. "We dress very plainly, though I can assure you we are often hard up for a new pair of boots or a coat or dress, and more particularly children's shoes. They take a trifle to keep their feet decently shod!" And this was a common theme in colonial commentary on the difficulties faced by the parents of large families. Rebecca and Joseph Elliot were not alone in desiring a smaller number of children, and sometime in the 1870s, certainly by the 1880s, a remarkable transformation began in the size of the Australian family. Demographers call this phenomenon the first fertility transition, and it saw a shift from the previous uncontrolled high fertility to lower fertility that appears to have been deliberately limited. Now, just how this happened has been the subject of endless speculation, as has why it happened then. although it seems to have taken place at about the same time as a similar transition in Britain and America, somewhat later in much of Europe. But by 1900, the size of completed families had fallen significantly to between 4 and 5 children, and it kept on falling. By the 1920s and 30s, 2 to 3 children was a common family size, and the large families of the past, while they did still exist, were increasingly seen as anachronisms. Now, just how this was achieved has been a topic of constant debate since the end of the 19th century, when statisticians first noticed it. At first, they were inclined to be horrified. The New South Wales government appointed a royal commission in 1903 to inquire into the decline of the birth rate, and their view was plain. Australia was a small country with wide open spaces. In whatever way the waning birth rate of New South Wales is viewed, the commissioners wrote, it is seen as a grave disorder, sapping the vitals of a new people, dispelling its hopes, blighting its prospects, and threatening its continuance. The press talked wildly about race suicide and accused women of selfishly avoiding their natural, and indeed their national, responsibilities. Educated women were singled out for particular blame, since their fertility was thought to be the lowest of all. A good deal of nonsense at the time argued that education developed the brain at the expense of the uterus, compromising women's capacity to bear children. But the point is really that this was all fulmination after the event. By then, Australians had clearly decided that they wanted smaller families, and they went about achieving them. Now, as is often the case, the cartoonists may have captured the mood of the people more accurately than the pompous social commentators. This small cartoon, published in The Critic, an Adelaide illustrated weekly in September 1899, shows a horrified father confronting huge triplets. Captioned cheekily, "Keeping his end up," the cartoonist has his, quote, startled father exclaim, "Great snakes, triplets!" And those blank idiots at the census office complain about decrease of the birth rate. Now, just how the fall in the birth rate was achieved has prompted spirited debate. There were contraceptive devices from about the 1870s, 1880s, notably an early form of the diaphragm, which could be inserted into the vagina to block the cervix. Even earlier forms of this method were pessaries made from various materials, including sponges, which could be inserted as a barrier in the vagina. They were not very effective in modern terms, but they probably worked to a degree. There were also condoms, but they were even less use and were tainted by their association with their use in brothels as a defence against syphilis. Respectable men probably hesitated to buy them, and certainly no respectable woman would do so. And there were various syringes which could be used as douches. Again, not hugely effective, but probably had some impact. Ideas about contraception were also circulating in radical reform circles in the 1870s. British authors Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh were prosecuted in Britain in 1877 for publishing an American birth control book, The Fruits of Philosophy, which argued in favour of birth control and also advised how it might be achieved. Their trial for obscenity was widely reported. But it was by no means easy to get access to either birth control information or contraceptives. Advertising such products was banned at first, and the devices themselves had to be sold under the counter or ordered by mail order. One remarkable woman who did her best to make both information and materials available in Victoria was Bettina Smythe. Bettina Smythe was a well-known figure in late 19th century Melbourne. A woman of commanding stature, she stood nearly 6 feet tall at a time when many women barely topped 5 feet. She was an eloquent advocate of women's health education and a committed campaigner for women's rights. From 1873, she supported herself and her children from a drapery and druggist shop. But she also lectured regularly on a range of health-related subjects. She had had some medical training, often to all women audiences. From her North Melbourne shop, she dispensed contraceptive devices, amongst other more conventional products. In late 1888, a legal judgment in New South Wales finally overturned a prosecution of birth control literature as obscene material. And shortly after this, Britannia began to advertise and sell both advice literature and, quote, artificial preventives, contraception devices, from her North Melbourne shop more openly. Her preferred device was the preventif PCR, or contraceptive check, which she described as the best, safest, and most sure check. It was, she added, the only article of the kind that can be used without the knowledge of the husband. She also produced a book, The Diseases of Women, and a range of pamphlets on topics such as love, courtship and marriage, and the limitation of offspring. Throughout the 1890s, she presented lecture courses on these topics, generally to women-only audiences, and from newspaper accounts at the time, they seem to have been very well attended. Now, while we can't know precisely how couples in Australia managed to limit their family size at this time, we can be quite certain that they did so. And at the same time, attitudes towards large families seem to have changed, so that it became both passé, perhaps even a little bit disreputable, to have large numbers of children. The vague implication was that couples should be able to control themselves better. Now, since one method of popular birth control was probably withdrawal by the husband, the cooperation of the husband was essential. When all else failed, there was also abortion, and one sad outcome of falling fertility was an apparent rise in the abortion rate. It's almost impossible to know how common abortion was in the past, since performing abortions was a criminal offence until 1969, indeed a capital offence if the mother died, which meant that it was shrouded in great secrecy. But the fact that there was little improvement in the maternal death rate until well into the 20th century may well reflect the after effects of abortion. In other respects, the management of childbirth became steadily safer as doctors and midwives embraced antiseptics from about the 1860s, and doctors learned more about how to avoid spreading infection from one patient to another. Caesarean sections, in the case of very difficult births, also became safer, but so-called backyard abortions continued to be extremely dangerous procedures. In her landmark study of the Royal Women's Hospital in Melbourne, Janet McCalman found that there was a marked increase in admissions with septic abortions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, tragically, many of those women died, as by the time they were admitted, the infections were often too advanced to treat successfully. And not all of those were single women desperate to avoid the shame of an unmarried pregnancy. There were married women too, including those who simply wanted no more children. We trace the career of one notorious abortionist, Elizabeth Downey, aka Isabella Allinson, who was active in North Melbourne and Carlton throughout the 1890s and early 1900s. She may have been practicing before this, but didn't come to the attention of the police. Now, they were certainly well aware of her activities by the 1890s, and they tried many times to catch her out, but repeatedly failed to secure convictions, even though she was tried for murder on 14 separate occasions from 1897. Several of the women who died were married women. In 1910, Downey was finally convicted when a young woman actually died while still on her premises. Abortionists were renowned for removing patients and leaving them in the grounds of the women's hospital at the first hint of any complications, so that they could avoid arrest and any subsequent charges. Elizabeth Downey died in Pentridge Prison in 1912, but the estate she left suggested that providing abortions was a lucrative business. The family was changing in other ways too in the mid to late 19th century. Throughout this century and for almost all of the next, marriage was the only sanctioned basis of family life. People did live together outside marriage, but they were often shunned by others in the community. And initially, marriage was for life, literally, till death us do part, as the Church of England marriage service required the bride and the groom to promise each other. In those circumstances, it paid to be careful about your marriage partner. At first, marriage and its dissolution was controlled by ecclesiastical courts in England. Marriage was a sacrament administered by the Church. Divorce was technically possible, but generally required a private act of the British Parliament, and so it was effectively out of reach of anyone but the highest nobility. But from the 1850s in England, there was an increasing move to detach marriage laws from the control of the Church, and laws for the dissolution of marriage were passed in England in 1857 and then in each Australian colony. At first, divorce was only available on very unequal grounds. In Victoria, for example, under the Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act of 1861, both parties could obtain a legal separation known as a judicial separation on equal grounds, but this didn't entitle them to remarry. Divorce was more difficult, especially for women, because the different moral standards applied to the sexes meant that while a man could obtain a divorce simply on the grounds of his wife's adultery, a wife had to prove adultery coupled with incest, bigamy, cruelty, or desertion without reasonable excuse for 2 years or more. It would be another century before divorce on equal grounds was enacted, by then part of the Commonwealth government's jurisdiction, and 1975 before so-called no-fault divorce was possible. For a very long time then, the decision to marry was a weighty one, especially for women. For once she married, a woman lost her separate legal existence. She became, in effect, her husband's chattel. As one legal expert put it, "My wife and I are one, and I am he." She couldn't enter into contracts, sue or be sued. Even any independent earnings were the legal property of her husband, as was the custody of her children. The parents of very wealthy women might make special provision for their daughters in a legal settlement before marriage, but that was generally confined to the very richest in society. If a wife was proved to be unfaithful to her husband, he could claim legal damages from her lover and also divorce her, with the proceedings often reported in local newspapers. This continued well into the 20th century, as you can see here, and quite substantial damages could be granted, as this report in the Herald from 1949 reveals. From the 1880s, a series of Married Women's Property Acts gradually improved the legal capacity of married women to own property, control their own earnings, and operate independently of their husbands. But it was a gradual process, and much inequality remained. By the beginning of the 20th century, governments around Australia were aware that the Australian family was changing. It was becoming smaller, and women were clearly choosing smaller families. Governments began to focus on policies to encourage women to have children, but also to improve the survival rates of infants and young children. Following its landmark introduction of age pensions, in 1912, the Fisher Federal Labor Government introduced a baby bonus of £5 to be paid to a mother, directly to the mother, on the birth of a child. Now, in a revolutionary step, this was provided regardless of marital status, and it was intended to help improve the survival rates of newborn infants. It was, however, provided to white women only, and specifically excluded First Nations mothers, in line with explicit policies of discrimination against First People and non-white people. And those exclusions remained in place until 1942. Governments also began to support the provision of infant health clinics and kindergartens for less privileged children. The first clinic was established in Richmond in 1917, with others following in other industrial suburbs, and it was assumed that working-class mothers were most in need of instruction in infant welfare. From 1918, state governments helped to subsidise these clinics. From the 1920s and 30s, they began to spread to regional areas, some with the help of the Victorian railways. And here, women and girls are given a lecture on child welfare by an infant health nurse travelling around regional Victoria on the Better Farming Train, an initiative of Victorian Railways and the Department of Agriculture. In the early 20th century, governments also supported various schemes to assist families with home ownership. It was assumed that home ownership was socially desirable, as it gave families stability and a stake in the community. One important initiative in Victoria was the State Savings Bank of Victoria's Home Building Scheme. This program was created to assist first home buyers who earned less than £400 a year to build on their own land or on blocks of land purchased from the bank. Purchasers required a 10% deposit and had to maintain a savings account at the bank for some years before they qualified for a loan. But then long-term loans were made available at low interest rates to build homes, with the bank holding title to the land as collateral. The scheme began in 1910 and it was soon a great success, both socially and financially for the bank. In the 1920s, the bank established its own building department, which provided architect-designed house plans with detailed specifications for both brick and timber frame dwellings. By the 1930s, prospective builders could choose from over 50 house plans, with the build itself supervised by the bank. Such homes had a well-earned reputation for quality, and the description bank house was a hallmark for a well-built house for many decades in Melbourne. The State Bank building program continued into the 1960s with a break during World War II, and over the decades it built many thousands of homes for Victorians. You probably know that home ownership reached a peak in 1966 at 71% of all occupiers. Now, perhaps unfortunately, government's focus on home ownership meant that public housing represented a much smaller proportion, a mere 5% of all housing stock. From the early decades of the 20th century, most of the poor lived in rented properties in the inner city, near to the factories and other places of employment. Many were in a very poor condition. Social advocacy groups mounted a concerted campaign in the 1930s to expose what they called life in these slums, with confronting photographs like these published in newspapers like the Herald. They shocked complacent Melburnians, but worse was to come. A report commissioned by Victoria's Housing Investigation and Slum Abolition Board, created in response to this campaign, documented housing in inner Melbourne and its near suburbs. It found people crammed into areas with as many as 49 dwellings per acre, many in very poor repair. An internal survey of over 6,000 substandard residences within an 8-kilometre radius of the city found that most had no proper kitchen, a third had no bathroom, and a quarter had neither gas nor electricity. Half of these houses were found to be unfit for habitation without substantial repairs. The other half couldn't even be repaired. It was a grim report, and it prompted government to create the Housing Commission of Victoria in 1937. The Housing Commission had a brief to improve housing conditions for low-income families and to develop low-cost accommodation, both rental and for sale. One such development was located in Port Melbourne, on 22 hectares of land adjacent to the State Bank's Garden City development. Here, the Housing Commission built accommodation to rehouse large, so-called deprived families in the late 1930s. By 1956, the Commission had built 32,000 homes, mostly single-family houses and low-rise apartments. Other building projects of the Housing Commission were not so popular. Between 1962 and 1974, the Housing Commission also built 47 high-rise towers at 21 locations across Melbourne, until a rising tide of dissent halted further building in the 1970s. And the Housing Commission was eventually abolished in 1984, but the current acute shortage of affordable housing has led to suggestions that some similar body should perhaps be reconstituted. Meanwhile, the 1960s and 70s saw further major changes in the Australian family. One momentous event was the release in early 1961 of the contraceptive pill. The pill offered reliable contraception without fuss or mess, and for the first time allowed women to engage in sexual activity without fear of pregnancy. Sexual fulfillment became a realistic goal for both women and men. Now, whether it facilitated the so-called sexual revolution that is often associated with the swinging 60s is another matter. There is no doubt that premarital sex was on the increase in the period after the Second World War. Demographers have tracked a steep rise in the incidence of what they call premarital conceptions, in other words, first babies conceived before marriage, from the end of the war until the early 1970s, including increasing numbers of teenage mothers. In 1961, teenage mothers accounted for 17% of all first mothers, and that rate did not fall during the 60s. Of course, not all of those were teenage girls with unplanned pregnancies, but many probably were. What role the release of the pill played in this increased sexual activity outside marriage is unclear, but it was probably limited. The pill required a prescription from a doctor, and at first it was rarely provided to single women. But for married women, the pill could be a revelation, and its main significance probably lay in the way it transformed relations within marriage. There can be little doubt that access to the pill allowed women to control their fertility with a degree of certainty not possible before. Family size fell again almost immediately, while women were also able to space their children with confidence. Freed from the ever-present fear of pregnancy, women were also able to express themselves sexually for the first time, and that may have removed one of the greatest barriers to marital harmony afflicting earlier generations. Demographers now describe the changing fertility patterns of the period from the 1970s as the second family transition. And the changes have been momentous indeed. Australia's fertility rate has been below the official replacement rate, which is considered to be 2.1 births per woman, since 1976. It now hovers between about 1.6 and 1.7. This means that Australia's population growth in these decades was driven entirely by immigration, not natural increase. Women not only bore fewer children in the early 21st century, they also gave birth much later than in previous generations. In 1981, only 15% of first mothers were aged over 30. By 2019, over half had their first child in their 30s, while 17% were aged over 35, and that was an increase from only 5% in 1991. Teenage mothers virtually disappeared. Age at first marriage has also changed markedly, with both men and women now marrying much later than ever before. In 2019, the median age of first marriage for men was 31 and for women 29. And this partly reflected another major change in relations between the sexes, because by 2019, a majority of couples also lived together before marriage. Estimates suggest that while only about 16% of couples cohabited before marriage in 1975, some 81% did so in 2017. As many as a third of all children were born out of wedlock by this time, but without the social stigma attached to so-called illegitimate births in previous decades. Pregnant brides no longer bother to conceal the fact. Of course, divorce rates have also changed. It's very difficult, actually, to estimate the precise proportion of marriages dissolved over time, but most sources agree that there was a notable increase in divorce rates once the no-fault divorce clauses of the Family Law Act came into effect in 1976. Statisticians estimate that perhaps about 1/3 of marriages now end in divorce, but rates are actually falling as couples marry later and many opt to cohabit instead. Perhaps the greatest challenge to traditional concept of marriage and family life has come from changing views about who might marry. There was increasing acceptance of same-sex couples from the 1980s, but no popular agreement about whether they should be allowed to marry. Ironically, although marriage was always assumed to be the union of a man and a woman, it was not so defined in law, presumably because it never occurred to lawmakers that they needed to do so. The Family Law Act of 1975, for example, referred to marriage as, quote, the union of two people to the exclusion of all others voluntarily entered into for life. Now, as pressure to recognise same-sex marriage increased in the early years of this century, the Conservative Howard federal government introduced an amendment to the Federal Marriage Act, which unequivocally defined marriage as, quote, the union of a man and a woman, and provided that same-sex marriages entered into under the law of another country would not be recognised in Australia. After 22 failed attempts, this amendment was finally overturned in 2017, when same-sex marriage was legalised, after a voluntary postal vote confirmed that a clear majority of Australians favoured change. Now, perhaps the final word about the changing Australian family concerns the role of women within it. As we saw in the 1850s, social reformers like Caroline Chisholm saw wives and little children as civilising forces in gold rush Victoria. And until the 1960s, it was expected that women's lives would revolve around their families. Those women who worked before marriage usually resigned when they decided to have children. And indeed, women who either had to work or chose to work found access to childcare very difficult. Now, this changed significantly from the 1970s, with the impact of women's liberation, which made affordable childcare an electoral issue for the first time. Governments of all political persuasions now support the provision of subsidised childcare, at least partly in the hope that this will encourage women to have children, while a majority of mothers now work outside the home on either a part-time or a full-time basis. Indeed, it seems reasonable to suggest that while the Australian family has changed in almost every respect since the 1840s, it remains very important politically, with both major parties vying for what they call the, quote, family vote. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Margie. That was brilliant and quite comprehensive, I think everyone will agree. Just to note that if you're interested in more about the family home, Margaret explored the topic further in The Great Australian Dream, A Home of Our Own, which is available on our YouTube channel. Now, we have run out of time, so if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact us at info, that's info, @otb.org.au. We hope you'll all join us again next Friday, the 8th of May at 1 p.m. for the next session in our Material History Seminar Series, Belief, Magic and Supernatural, The Power of Objects. Tickets are available through Humanitix. Before we close today, I will spruik our Swinging 60s exhibition, of course, open until 2027, and the Old Treasury Building is open Sunday to Friday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m, closed Saturdays and public holidays, and of course entry is free. Thank you all for listening, and we hope to see you in the museum soon. Bye.